Today, we're diving into a really pivotal era in world history, new imperialism. Now, this wasn't just some simple land grab. No, it was a period defined by this powerful, almost volatile combination of intense motivation and absolutely groundbreaking technology. And that combo is what allowed just a few nations to pretty much dominate the globe. Let's get into it. So think about this. Between the late 1800s and the start of World War I, the political maps of Africa and Asia were completely and honestly violently redrawn. So you have to ask yourself, how was that even possible? On such a massive scale and at such a blistering pace? Well, that's the big question we're going to answer right now. To get how it happened, we first have to understand why it happened. What was the engine driving this whole quest for empire? It turns out it was a pretty complex machine, powered by a mix of economics, politics, and some very, very potent ideas. Right at the heart of it all was the Industrial Revolution. It created this relentless two-part cycle. First, you had factories in Europe with just a bottomless appetite for raw materials, stuff they couldn't find at home. Then, once those materials were turned into products, companies were desperate for new markets, new people to sell to. So expansion wasn't just an option. For a lot of these industries, it felt like an absolute economic necessity. But it wasn't just about the money. Owning a huge empire became the ultimate measure of a nation's power and prestige. And this kicked off a frantic, almost paranoid race among European powers. The famous scramble for Africa is the perfect example of this, where countries like Britain, France, and Belgium just started carving up the continent, a lot of the time just to stop their rivals from getting a piece of the pie. So how did they justify all this? Well, a powerful and, frankly, dangerous ideology gave them the moral cover they needed: social Darwinism. This took Charles Darwin's biological theory and twisted it into a social one. The argument basically went like this. Because European nations were technologically advanced, they were fitter, and therefore had a natural right to rule over so-called weaker societies. And this whole idea was captured perfectly in the concept of a civilizing mission, or as the writer Rudyard Kipling famously put it, the white man's burden. Imperialism was framed not as a brutal conquest, but as this noble, self-sacrificing duty to bring Western culture, religion, and medicine to the rest of the world. They were, as Kipling wrote, serving their captives' need. Okay, so the motives were there, right? Economic need, political rivalry, and this ideological justification. But, ambition is one thing, actually being able to act on it is something else entirely. So now let's look at the tools, the technology that made it all possible. The military gap was just staggering. Breech-loading rifles meant soldiers could reload way faster, even while lying down. Rifling in the barrels made every shot more accurate and deadlier. But the real game changer? The machine gun. This wasn't warfare between equals. More often than not, it was a complete slaughter, enabled by industrial technology. Just think about that number for a second. 600 rounds per minute. A small European force with just one or two of these weapons could hold off and defeat armies many, many times their size. This is a perfect example of how technology created an almost unbeatable advantage on the battlefield. But domination wasn't just about winning battles. It was about controlling huge territories. And technology systematically tore down the natural barriers that had protected these regions for centuries. Steamships and railways opened up impassable jungles and plains. The telegraph meant you could send orders and control things from thousands of miles away, instantly, and new medicines conquered deadly diseases. And one medicine in particular was a total game changer: quinine. See, for centuries, malaria had made large parts of Africa, often called the white man's grave, almost impossible for Europeans to survive in for very long. Quinine changed everything. So how did one little medicine unlock an entire continent? Well, by providing an effective treatment and preventative for malaria, quinine basically acted like a key. It unlocked the African interior. It took away that massive biological barrier that had held European expansion back for so long, and that directly enabled the scramble for Africa. Okay, so what happens when you combine that powerful engine of motivation with this brand new toolkit of domination? The result is a world redrawn, at a speed and on a scale that had never, ever been seen before. The Opium Wars are a textbook case. You had British economic interests selling opium to fix a trade deficit, which were then enforced by its modern steam-powered navy. China's traditional forces just couldn't compete. And the result? China was forced to open up to Western powers. It was a crystal-clear demonstration of economic motives being backed up by pure technological might. And this chart, wow, this chart says it all. In 1870, about 10% of Africa was under European control. By 1914, just a little over 40 years later, that number had jumped to 90%. That shocking acceleration was the direct result of pairing that intense political competition with the new tools of domination: the machine gun, the steamship, and, of course, quinine.
All right, so what's the big takeaway here? What's the one core idea we need to pull from this era? Here's the thing. The desire for empire wasn't new. What was new was the capacity to achieve it on a global scale. The Industrial Revolution didn't just create the desire to expand, it gave them the specific, overwhelming technological tools to actually do it. And that lethal combination of ambition and ability is what really defines new imperialism.
So that machinery of dominance, built from economic cycles, political rivalries, and technological advantages, was all assembled over a century ago, which leaves us with one last crucial question to think about. Which of its gears are still turning and still shaping our world today?